Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons, and in this video lecture we're going to go into the second part of the marine fishes chapter. So in the first part of the marine fishes chapter we talked about the major groups of fishes we find in the ocean. So we talked about the jawless fishes, the cartilaginous fishes, and the bony fishes. In this chapter, or in this part of the chapter I should say, we're going to kind of talk more broadly about how fish survive in the ocean and what are the sort of special ways that they deal with living in the ocean environment. In this fish that you see here, this is maybe one of my favorite fishes. This is what's known as a scrawled filefish. This is something that you can find on all coral reef areas everywhere in the world. It's one of the few coral reef fishes that are found in coral reefs virtually everywhere. So I've seen these in the Caribbean, I've seen these in the Indian Ocean, I've seen these in the Red Sea. You can find them anywhere. And they're really inquisitive fish. This one literally swam right up to me and allowed me to take a picture of it, which was really nice of it. So let's talk a little bit about the coloration that fishes have. Because coloration for any animal is really important because a lot of times it has something important to do with reproduction, and it has something important to do with hiding from either things you want to eat or things that you don't want to eat you. So there's a lot of fishes that have chromatophores on them. We learned this term back when we talked about squid and cephalopods in general. So these are chromatophores are small cells that allow an animal to change its color and to change it very rapidly, not like changing its color, over a long period of time, over days, more like in a couple seconds it can change its color. And what you see on the right are two Nassau groupers. So these are groupers that you find in the Caribbean. Sadly, not as much as you used to, but nonetheless, you can still find these in certain places in the Caribbean. And what you see on the top, this is a Nassau grouper with its typical coloration. It has this beautiful kind of brown and white stripe pattern and this dark splotch on what's known as its caudal peduncle. This fish here is a Nassau grouper that is getting ready to spawn. Essentially, they change their colors around when they go into spawning aggregations and are ready to spawn. So a lot of fishes will change colors when they are ready to reproduce. Another kind of important aspect of coloration in fishes is that a lot of fishes use what's known as counter shading. And this picture of this tuna is a perfect example of this. So you'll notice that this tuna is dark on the top and light on the bottom. And what that allows is for this tuna to be well camouflaged when you're looking down on it or when you're looking up at it. So imagine you're at the surface of the water looking down, and below you it's dark. And so if you're looking at the dark top of a tuna, it's going to be very hard to see it. Imagine if you're below this tuna looking up towards the surface. So there's light up at the surface, and so the light bottom of this tuna is going to make it hard to see. So many fishes have this counter shading that makes it difficult to spot them from above or to spot them from below. A lot of fishes have very cryptic coloration. So believe it or not, there is a fish in this picture. It's very hard to spot. Maybe try to see if you can find it for a second or two. Most people can't. I wasn't able to when I was doing this dive. Another person pointed this fish out to me. But it's in the middle of the photograph. Right? So look around the middle, see if you can see something that looks like a fish. If you're still not sure, this is the head of a fish. Here's the whole body of it, and here's the tail fin. And this right here is one of its pectoral fins. And so its eyes are kind of hidden kind of right there and right there. Right? So a really well hidden fish. And this is what is known as cryptic coloration. So cryptic meaning hard to see and kind of blending in. So this fish obviously blends in really well with its surroundings. Here's then a close-up of that same fish. Still kind of hard to see what's going on there, right? So this is the mouth of the fish. Here's one eye. There's another eye. These are these sort of antenna things it has. Here's one of its pectoral fins, another of its pectoral fins. There's some of its dorsal fins, and then the tail kind of extends down to there. So really well hidden fish. Sometimes fish are very conspicuous. And so this lionfish, what it is basically doing is advertising the fact that it tastes really bad. And so this lionfish is not exactly as if it tastes bad, but it has venom in it, right? So these spines on the top right there, and then the spines on the bottom have a really potent toxin in them that if you essentially go to eat this thing, and you don't have hands like we do, like if you're a shark, for instance, and you go to eat this thing, you get all these spines in your mouth that have a venom in them. And that venom is incredibly painful. I have always managed to avoid getting stung by a lionfish, even though I've hunted for them and done research on them for a long time. But anybody that I know that has been stung by one of these said that it was an incredibly painful experience. So this lionfish, with its really bright colors and its stripes and its blue splotches on its fins, it's essentially advertising, hey, I'm really conspicuous, and why I'm so conspicuous is because I taste bad. So don't try eating me. That's a bad idea. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the shapes of fishes. Because fishes obviously come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. In the shape that they have tends to match the habitat in which they're found, and it matches the lifestyle that they have. So for instance, a fish that would be tight would be good for moving around within tight spaces, like say in caves or in and amongst, say, coral reefs, right? Which one of these fishes do you think might suit that purpose well? So probably a lot of you are thinking, okay, the eel kind of fits that purpose well. It's long and thin. Same with this snipe eel or this gunnel, maybe even the sea moth, right? Those are things that can navigate around tight spaces. How about a fish that is best for being in really broad open areas? Uh, so the fish here that does the best with that is something like a tuna. And why tunas are so good at that is because they're torpedo shaped and they're incredibly streamlined. They're kind of like the Ferraris or Maseratis of the fish world, because all of these fins they can kind of tuck into their body so that when they swim they've got very, very little drag to slow them down. They're just super streamlined, which they need because tunas will cover large distances in the open ocean, right? So tunas will swim hundreds of miles a day, searching for food in the wide open ocean. Finally, what would be a good shape for being on the seafloor? I think you're probably all obviously thinking this one, the flounder. They've got a really good shape for being on the seafloor. Same with sea moss, they're pretty flat. Seahorses in general, you also tend to find on the seafloor. It's kind of the same with trunkfish, you find them in the seafloor. So different shapes of fishes really tells us a lot about where you would expect to find them and what you expect them to do, right? So something like a tuna, you can tell by its shape that it's really streamlined and has these really powerful fins for swimming really fast and over broad distances. Whereas something like this seahorse, you can kind of tell that this is something that is not it's not the Michael Phelps of the fish world. It is not an excellent swimmer. So the shape of the tail fins are really important as well. And in the particular shape that a fish has in its tail fin is going to tell us a little bit about whether it's good at long distance or whether it's good at short distance bursts. So first let's think about long distance. Right, so if there's a fish that is swimming long distances, every single day, it wants to have as little drag as possible, right? So it's going to have a fin that has minimal surface area, right? So take a look at these four pictures. In which one of these has the most minimal amount of surface area, right? So you should be looking at this one down here, the lunate tail. Lunate, it's named that way because of the moon. So like La Luna in Spanish, for instance, is the moon. That derives from Latin. That has to, it's a word that has to do with the moon. And obviously the fin of this tuna has a moon shape to it. So tunas are really good at swimming long distances because their tail fins have minimal drag. So what about a fish that would be really good at accelerating really quickly, right? Can really accelerate fast, can push off the water, and can go from not moving at all to moving very quickly. So that's going to be a tail fin that has a lot of surface area, a lot of drag. Because essentially to be able to push off the water and to be able to accelerate very quickly, you need to have a lot of surface area. It's kind of the same principle behind like drag racing cars, right? So racing cars will often have really big rear tires. Essentially, the more surface area you have on the ground, the more you can push off the ground and thrust yourself forward. So round tails and square tails are really good at that, right? So they have a lot of surface area. So a fish with one of these two types of tails, they're really good at being at a complete standstill and then accelerating very quickly. If you have a forked tail, you're kind of somewhere in between, right? You're not an excellent accelerator, you're not an excellent long distance swimmer, but you're kind of the best of both worlds. You can kind of do both. All right, so again, just to reiterate, if you have one of these tails, it means you can accelerate fast, but you're not really great at swimming long distances. If you have this tail, you're good at swimming long distances, but you can't really accelerate very quickly. Whereas if you have this tail, you're kind of somewhere in the middle. So I have a anecdote about barracudas, which if you look at the tail fin here, right, see if you can figure out what type of tail is that. So is that round, square, lunate, or is it forked? So these guys, it's kind of somewhere between forked and square. It's not completely square at the back, but it's more or less a square shape. And so that tells us that barracudas, because their tail fin is mostly square shaped, it tells us that they are really excellent at accelerating, right? So they're not particularly great at swimming long distances, but what they do well is accelerate. And I have an anecdote about that. When I was doing research for my PhD dissertation in the Bahamas, where I was doing my work on the Grand Bahama Bank, there was just tons and tons of barracudas around. And they are actually quite inquisitive fishes. They will swim right up to you and kind of look at you and try to figure out what you're doing. And so they're kind of it's kind of nervous seeing one of these at first because they do get close and they are very toothy, but you get kind of used to them. But there was one time that I was around a barracuda and I kind of noticed it and it was kind of looking at me, but I knew that this was kind of what they did. And all of a sudden it accelerated at me really fast, right? So imagine a toothy predator is swimming at you really fast all of a sudden. And it kind of whooshed right around me and ate a fish that was hiding behind me essentially, right? So the fish had seen the barracuda, was hiding behind me, so the barracuda wouldn't see it. The barracuda still sensed that it was there and accelerated at me, swam around me really fast and ate the fish. And this was all almost in the blink of an eye. The barracuda went around me so quickly that I barely was able even to see it go. And then more or less I just saw then a barracuda with kind of blood coming out of its mouth after I turned around to see what had happened. So barracudas, they accelerate really fast. Not great at long distance swimming, but definitely good at acceleration. So let's talk a little bit more about how fishes actually swim. Right? So most fishes use kind of what's known as a S-shaped swimming pattern, where they kind of bend their whole body into a S shape. And that S kind of moves back and forth. It kind of recoils back and forth. How they do that is with muscles that are along the body, right? So all fishes have some muscles along their right side and along their left side. And essentially by contracting those muscles, it will cause the body to bend, such as this. So like along this side of this eel right now, all these muscles here are contracted, which is causing it to bend in this way. And you can see how this works when you look at a fillet of a lot of fishes. So this is a fillet of a salmon, and you can see it has these lines running across it. So why it has those lines is because those are bands of muscle. In those muscles, when they contract, that's what causes the fish to bend in that shape. So the whole body contracts back and forth, and that's what pushes it along. And then the fins are used for thrusting. So like the tail fin on this fish, it pushes off the water and gives it some additional thrust, in addition to the thrust it gets from pushing its body off the water. And then they use their fins, so their fins on the bottom, the pelvic fins, fins on the side, the pectoral fins, fins on the top. They use all those fins to kind of steer the direction that they are going. So one important thing about fish locomotion is that fishes oftentimes swim in very different ways from each other, right? So the kind of typical way that fish swim is with that S-shaped kind of bending that I talked about. However, there are some fishes that do it completely differently. So this, for instance, is what's known as a parrotfish. You find these mostly in coral reef areas. They are relatives of another group of fishes known as wrasses, which you find in most parts of the ocean. And how these fish swim is with these fins right here, they're pectoral fins. They just kind of wave them back and forth, almost kind of like the wings of a bird. They barely use their caudal fin for thrust at all. It's mostly with their pectoral fins on the side that they just wave back and forth to move. A frogfish barely can swim at all. So frogfishes tend to just sit on the bottom and they use their fins on the bottom to kind of walk along the seafloor, kind of like a frog, which is why they're called frogfish. The only times that frogfish actually do swim is when they reproduce. So males and females will swim up into the water column, maybe just like 4 or 5 feet, and blast their eggs and sperm out into the water. So really just like a couple times a year, frogfish actually swim. Most of the time they're stationary on the seafloor. And the flying fish, I think a lot of you know what they do, right? So they will take to the air, and this is mainly a response to predators to get away from them. So they will accelerate out of the water, stretch out their pectoral fins, in these down here, their pelvic fins, and that will cause them to soar for up to a couple hundred meters, so up to maybe 500 or 600 feet. They can soar through the air. They can't actually fly, so they don't actually flap their wings or their fins, I should say, up and down and maintain flight in the air. But they can soar for long distances. And these guys, they're really fun to watch. And you can even see them in the waters off of California. Like if you've ever taken a boat out to Catalina, for instance, you'll see lots of these. And what kind of happens is if you're up on the front of the boat, the bow that is, these things will get scared by the approaching boat, and then you'll see them jump out of the water and go flying off to the left and to the right. It's really a lot of fun to watch them. So another aspect of locomotion that's really important is how one stays afloat and how one keeps one's position in the water column rather than sinking or floating up. So how bony fishes deal with this, like this coral trout right here, which is a type of grouper. How bony fishes do it is they have a gas-filled bladder known as a swim bladder. Uh, and uh, and inside of a bony fish, you can often see this. It's often right at it's pretty much always right at the top of the gut cavity, right? So all like their intestines and stomach, all that stuff is in there, and the swim bladder is always right at the top of that. And essentially, what they do is they can push air into the swim bladder. That makes them float up towards the surface, or they can take air out of the swim bladder, which makes them sink down towards the bottom. So it kind of works in the same way that a scuba diver uses a vest, right? So scuba divers use what's known as a buoyancy control device, and which is this vest sort of thing that they wear, and you can put air into it and you can take air out of it, and that controls one's buoyancy. So cartilaginous fishes, so things like sharks, rays, and skates, they don't have any sort of swim bladder. And so for them, they kind of have to use their fins in order to get lift and to keep themselves from swimming. So you've probably heard that a lot of sharks, they need to keep swimming in order to not sink to the bottom. That's absolutely true, because they don't have a swim bladder in order to keep themselves from sinking. So what sharks do is their fins kind of work like the wings of an airplane, right? So the wings of an airplane work such that as they're moving forward through the air very quickly, water passes or air passes over those wings in such a way that it makes lift that causes the airplane to go up off the ground. Sharks' fins are shaped in a similar way, where as they move through the water, their fins here, their pectoral fins, those will give them some lift and keep them from sinking. So that's how sharks and rays and skates, maintain their position in the water column. Of course, not all do that. A lot of them just sit on the seafloor. Things like wobbegong sharks and skates and a lot of stingrays. But ones that are up off the seafloor, they need to keep moving if they're not going to sink. Okay, last thing I want to talk about locomotion is speed, right? So there's a lot of really fast fish in the ocean. So I want you to think about which one of these do you think is the fastest of the fish? Is it a bluefin tuna, a mako shark, a black marlin, or a barracuda? Right, so think about that for a second. Which one do you think is the fastest? Well, if you picked black marlin, you picked correctly. So black marlins are by far the fastest fish in the ocean, and they've been clocked at speeds up to 80 miles an hour, right? Which is pretty damn fast. That's faster than most cars are driving on, say, the 101 or the 170. So that's pretty fast. Mako sharks and barracudas, Mako sharks and bluefin tunas, somewhere on the order of 40 or 50 miles an hour. Barracudas, they can accelerate really quickly, but they can't maintain a fast top speed. So that barracuda that shot around me to catch that fish was only going 27 miles an hour. It certainly felt a lot faster, and I certainly and I may have peed in the ocean a little bit when it did so. But it actually wasn't going that fast. Okay, another thing I wanted to talk about is the mouth shape of fishes, because the mouth shape of a fish will very much match, what that thing eats. You can look at the mouths of a lot of fishes and use it to figure out what that thing might be eating. So for instance, the picture that is up on the top here, this is the beak of a parrotfish. What parrotfishes do is they scrape algae and small invertebrates off the surface of dead coral. And so it has these really hard, rigid beaks that are all the teeth fused together that are used for scraping algae off of rocks. The teeth that you have obviously wouldn't be very good at that. Wouldn't be very pleasant to try to scrape plants off of concrete, for instance. But if you had teeth like this, you could do so with no problem. If you have a really thin mouth like this, that means that you eat small things, like the small polyps of corals or small plankton that happen to be drifting by. If you have a mouth like this with big teeth and a mouth that is really wide, you're obviously used to eating larger things. And those sharp teeth are used for, holding on to prey that you've grabbed, or they are used for serrating, for pulling bits of flesh off of a prey that you're eating. Finally, a lot of fish have gill rakers. So these are the actual gill filaments that a fish uses in order to breathe. And these comb-like things here are known as gill rakers. And so what those gill rakers are used for by a lot of fish is in order to collect small little bits of food that are in the water. So things like manta rays or whale sharks, they have these big gill rakers that they use in order to trap very small bits of food drifting in the water. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about how fish breathe. So obviously they use their gills because they don't have lungs like we do, with the notable exception of a lungfish, which can use its lungs to breathe a little bit, but still very much relies on its gills. So there's three parts of a gill of a fish. So there's the gill arch, which is kind of the bony part that holds it all together and gives it some structure. There are the gill rakers, which I just talked about a minute ago. Those are the parts that might be used for getting food particles off of out of the water. If a fish has really small gill rakers like this one, it's probably not a filter feeder. Instead, these gill rakers are kind of a form of protection for the gills. So if anything, so say this fish eats another fish, these gill rakers will keep that smaller fish from thrashing around into the gills, which is dangerous because the gills are what they use for breathing. And then finally, the filament, that's these things right here, and that's where oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide goes out. So diffusion of those two gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens in the gill filaments, and so oxygen goes into these small capillaries, these small like tubes of blood that are flowing through the filaments, and then goes into larger arteries and veins, and then into the rest of the circulatory system of the fish. So that's how fish breathe. And that's why a live fish, its gills will be a really bright red color because they're full of blood that is absorbing oxygen from the water and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Okay, let's talk about senses a little bit, right? So all fishes have a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system just like us, right? So central nervous system meaning a brain and a spinal cord, and then peripheral nervous system meaning all of the sensing organs around their bodies, right? So like eyes and nostrils, and then some other things that we don't have, right? So fishes have all the same senses that we do, right? So they can see things, they can smell things, they can taste things, they can feel it when you touch them, they can hear things, and they even have some senses that we don't have. Right, so you may have seen this movie back in the 90s. What you probably didn't know is that it's actually a spin-off of a movie about a fish that can see dead people. Obviously, I'm joking. It's not really what that's based on. But fish do not necessarily sense dead people, but they do sense other things that we aren't able to sense. So for instance, fish are able to detect vibrations that are around them. Don't worry about the lionfish water jet lecture thing. Sorry about that. So one thing that fish have that we don't is they have something known as a lateral line. And that lateral line runs along the length of a fish. And how that lateral line works is it's a bunch of little tubes running along the surface of the fish. And those tubes have little holes that lead to the outside, to the water around them. And so what happens is when water is moving around them, water pushes into these little canals and moves through these little canals. And inside of these little canals, there are these little sensory organs, these little things that are like little hairs that stick into those canals. And when water moves back and forth past this little hair, it causes it to bend back and forth because this little hair is flexible. And as it bends back and forth, signals are sent, through this nerve into the spinal cord and into the brain of the fish. And the fish is then able to detect and cognate the movement of this thing going back and forth, which tells the fish something about how water is moving around it. So fish can feel vibrations around them. So even if a fish was blind and couldn't smell and couldn't feel anything, just swimming up towards it, it would know that you were there because it would feel the vibrations in the water that you are producing as you approach that fish. So fish can feel movement around them with their lateral line. So then a cool sense that cartilaginous fishes have is something known as the ampullae of Lorenzini, which I know sounds maybe more like a pasta dish, but is actually just a part of a cartilaginous fish, so a shark or a ray or a skate. In this video that you see mentioned here, I'll post it onto Canvas for you so you can see what I'm talking about here. So inside of the face of cartilaginous fishes such as these sharks, there are these little jelly-like sensory organs called ampullae of Lorenzini. And what they do is they detect electrical charges in the water around them. And so why that is useful is because anything that has a heart essentially produces an electrical field around them. Because there's kind of electromagnetic stuff going on with your heart. So when your heart beats, it's producing a little bit of electricity. So when you go in the water, you in fact are producing an electrical field around you. And sharks and rays and skates are able to feel that field. And they can feel that field of other living things, say fishes or squid or things that they might want to eat. They're able to detect that. So which is kind of crazy. So even if a shark can't see you or smell you or feel you if you're staying perfectly still, it can still sense that you're there just based on the electrical current that you produce. Right, so fish really have some remarkable senses for detecting the world around them, for detecting prey or for detecting predators that might try to eat them, which makes sense in a lot of ways because fishes have been around for such a long time. So there's been a long amount of time for these really cool adaptations to evolve. Okay, then the last thing I wanted to talk about in this chapter is a little bit about some behaviors that fishes have. And so one really important behavior that a lot of fishes use is schooling. So schooling, I think that the obvious benefit to it or that the benefit to it is pretty obvious to most of us. You know, it makes it harder for a predator to eat you, right? It's the sort of safety in numbers approach. And why this works is for a couple of reasons. A bunch of small fish together appear larger when they're in a school, which means that maybe a predator will just stay away from them because it's intimidated by the large size of this thing. It also makes it a lot harder to target any one prey. So these little fish, as they're swimming around in and out of the school, it's very difficult to target any one of them to try to eat. I know this because, doing research at different times, I've had the task of counting fish, and it's very hard to count fish in a school because as they move around, it's very easy to lose track of where each fish is that you have counted. And then just kind of the sort of like logistical, just kind of basic reason why schooling works is because consider this example, right? So you're hiking in the woods and you come across a mountain lion, and the mountain lion wants to eat you, right? Your chances of getting away from that mountain lion are pretty slim because you need to be able to run faster than the mountain lion to get away from it. And I can guarantee you cannot run faster than a mountain lion. However, say you're with a group of friends and you're out in the woods and a mountain lion comes upon you and it wants to eat one of you. Now you only have to run faster than your slowest friend. And the same goes with these fish here, right? So each one of these fish, as long as there's another fish around them that is slower and dumber than they are, then that's going to be the one that gets eaten, not them. So that's kind of the safety in number effect, right? When you're in a school, you don't need to be able to get away from the predator. You just need to be able to get away from the predator in a better way than the others around you. You basically just need to be faster than the other prey around you. Something that a lot of fishes have and a lot of animals in general have is territoriality. So territoriality typically goes for areas that are really important in terms of feeding or in terms of reproduction. So that's what this little fish does here. This is what's known as a damselfish. This is a relative of the Garibaldi, which is that bright orange fish, which is the state fish of California. And this little fish is what's known as a gardener. So it will protect a little area and keep other fishes from coming into its area that are going to eat its algae that it gardens. That way it has all of that algae to itself. So it guards that little area. And in addition, these fish will lay their eggs on the sea floor. So when one of these fish has some eggs in its little territory, it'll be very, very aggressive and even attack scuba divers. And it may be hard to tell in the picture just how big this fish is, but they get no more than like maybe 4 or 5 inches. So you can imagine the audacity of like a 4-inch long fish attacking a full-grown human scuba diver. But that's what they do because they're very, very territorial and they don't want you eating their eggs or their algae. You kind of see the same thing going on here, but in a much more aggressive looking fish. So this is a reef shark that is posturing. So you see it's kind of arching its back up and it's kind of pushing its fins down. It is essentially making itself bigger. And so a lot of sharks will be very territorial. They'll have their own areas that they like to hang out and hunt and do their reproducing in. And sometimes sharks don't like other, sharks or people coming into their areas. So if you ever happen to be around a shark and see it doing this, you should probably get out of there because that shark does not want you to be there. I did not take this photo. I don't know who this person is that took it. I hope that they still have their limbs, but if I was to see a shark doing this, I would get the hell out of the water very quickly. So a lot of the behaviors that fishes use in order to assert their territoriality is like posturing like this shark is doing, making itself look bigger. Things like these damselfish will dart out at things to try to scare them away. Some fishes will make sounds. So for instance, there's a fish called a grunt, which you can probably guess it makes a grunting noise when it's being territorial. Groupers make noises, these sort of like loud underwater booming noises. So there's a lot of ways that fishes will make their aggressiveness known to things that have come into their territory. Okay, a lot of fishes engage in mutualisms. I don't think I'll talk about this too much because we've definitely covered this before. But a mutualism is any beneficial arrangement between species. So it's like a trade. So on the right here, you see what's known as a cleaning station. So these smaller fishes are what are known as cleaning wrasses, and they are cleaning this larger fish, which is known as a client. So they're eating all the parasites out of the gills and out of the mouth and off the skin of this larger client. And so the smaller fish, the wrasse, gets a meal, and the larger fish gets all of the parasites removed from it. So it's a pretty nice little arrangement. Of course, it is a lot more complex than that because sometimes the smaller fish will cheat and eat part of the larger fish. Sometimes the larger fish will eat the smaller fish. So it's not completely copacetic all the time, but this is kind of the basis of that relationship of it being positive to each. And in the picture over here, we see shrimp goby mutualism. So the goby is the small fish, the shrimp is obviously the shrimp, and what goes on here is that the shrimp can't see, but can make a really nice hole in the sand. The fish, on the other hand, can see really well because it's got big eyes, but it can't make a hole in the sand. So what they do is that the shrimp does the burrow maintenance. So it digs out the hole, the burrow, and the fish can live inside of that hole with it. And in trade, the fish sits at the entrance of the burrow and acts as a little signaler, a little watchman. And if there's a predator outside of the burrow, it will shake its tail back and forth, and that'll indicate to the shrimp that it should get back into the hole. Otherwise, it faces the risk of getting eaten. So that's shrimp goby mutualism. Okay, one last kind of important behavior that a lot of fishes use that I want to talk about is migrations. Right, so there are a lot of fishes that migrate long distances either for feeding or for reproducing. So for instance, there's a whole group of fish that are known as anadromous. So things like salmon, things like lampreys, these very ancient type of fish known as sturgeon, they will spend their adulthood in oceans, but then they'll go back to freshwater in order to reproduce. So adults in the ocean, and then they go to freshwater to reproduce. Little babies are born in freshwater in a river or a creek or whatnot. Then that little baby fish goes down to the ocean and lives out its life there before going back to the river in order to reproduce. So that's anadromous. The opposite of that is catadromous species. This includes like the North American eel, for instance. So eels will spend their adulthood inside of rivers and lakes in North America. And then they'll go out into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, actually, to an area known as the Sargasso Sea in order to reproduce. It took scientists a very long time to figure out where the heck it was that eels would reproduce. Because inside of rivers and lakes, you only see adults, you would never see babies, which made scientists wonder where in the hell are all the babies? There's got to be babies somewhere, and they eventually found them in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Which is pretty wild that the eels that you find in rivers and lakes in North America, that they just go out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to reproduce. It's kind of crazy. And so what fishes use for navigating is oftentimes a mix of the magnetic field of the earth and smell. So things like salmon, like you see in this picture here with me and my buddy Luke, this salmon essentially used the Earth's magnetic field. This salmon has its own version of a compass inside of it. And it used that compass to kind of navigate in the right direction. And then once it got closer to the river that it wanted to go to, it then would use its sense of smell. So essentially what happens is at one point this salmon was a little salmon and it was born in this very river. And what happens is the smell of that river is imprinted upon it and it remembers that smell. So when it's an adult and is going back, it'll navigate to that same exact river using its nose to figure out its way. And so this is something that in general salmon do. They're remarkably accurate at getting back to the same exact river that they were born in a few years earlier. And this applies even to what are known as hatchery fish. So a hatchery fish is a fish that is born in a big concrete kind of basin and then dumped into a river once it gets to be a few inches long. So even fish that are born essentially in captivity and dumped into a river, they will do the same thing. They go to the ocean and come back to the same river. And that includes this fish. So this was a hatchery fish. And so this fish would have been born in captivity in a large tub, a large concrete tub or basin, then dumped in this river, went out to the ocean for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and then came back in an attempt to spawn. Unfortunately, there it ran into my friend Luke and then became, dinner for the two of us. Okay, so that's all I've got to say about the fishes for now. So in the next video lecture, we will be covering other things with backbones in the ocean. Mainly, we'll be talking about the things in the ocean that breathe air and have backbones.